The laborer's craft in the construction or environmental trades is important and satisfying work. It challenges your mind and body. Many job skills involve technically complicated procedures and equipment combined with strenuous physical activity. Satisfaction is gained through variety, working on many different sites, performing many different jobs, and meeting a variety of co-workers that improve our lives. The work satisfies because it's permanent, whether restoring a toxic waste site to parkland or building a high-rise office building that will be there for generations. The product of our skills proves the usefulness of the work. However, construction work is also very dangerous. More injuries occur in construction work than any other occupation in North America. But injuries are only part of the growing problem of exposure to dangerous materials and chemicals on the job. Reliable estimates suggest that as many as 7 out of 10 construction workers on any given job are exposed to dangerous chemicals. In fact, if you look around at the job site, you'll find dangerous materials everywhere. Fumes from welding contain harmful gases and heavy metals. Vapors and mists from cleaning solvents can be absorbed by your body. Dust from mixing mortar and breaking concrete can irritate your throat and harm your lungs. Breathing carbon monoxide from combustion engines reduces oxygen levels in the body. Sands, acids, and bases can damage your skin and other body organs on contact. And the atmosphere in confined spaces, such as manholes and tanks, often contain toxic materials. Still, it's possible to work productively and safely around these materials. The key is knowledge, knowing about the materials and knowing how to protect yourself. The Material Safety Data Sheet is one of the best and most complete sources of information about hazardous materials on the job. It contains several types of information, each of which is useful to workers. The Material Safety Data Sheets, often called MSDSs, must be provided or supplied by the manufacturer or the supplier of a hazardous material. The Material Safety Data Sheet must be written in English. Employers are required to keep them on file at the job site and make them available to you during your normal shift. The MSDS provides you with practical information about how to mix, use, and dispose of the material. It also includes background information on the chemical. Even though the MSDS can be difficult to read, with practice and with the clues given on this video, you can become very good at reading, understanding, and using the information you need to protect yourself. Now let's work through a typical MSDS so you know how to read it. The first section of the MSDS usually identifies the chemical by its name. This is important to you because the name of the chemical must match the name on the label of the container that came to the job site. This section also includes the name and address of the manufacturer and a phone number. The phone number is very important because if there is something on the MSDS that you do not understand, or if you have an emergency, that number is the place to call for additional help. In addition, the first section usually contains the date when the MSDS was prepared, so you know if the information on this particular product is current. The second section of an MSDS is usually labeled Hazardous Ingredients and contains the specific chemical name and common name of the substances that make up the hazardous material. Section 2 also tells you the amount of each component in the mixture. Sometimes this section contains exposure information that usually is included in a later MSDS section, so we will talk about it when we come to that section. The third section of an MSDS contains information on the physical and chemical features of the material, including technical information like boiling point, vapor pressure, vapor density, and the appearance and odor of the material. Some of this information is very important when you are working with a material. For example, the vapor density tells us how much heavier or lighter than air the vapor of the substance is. If a vapor density is greater than 1, The vapors will tend to stay on the floor or in a ditch. This can greatly increase your exposure risk if you're working in those areas. The vapor pressure means how quickly a substance evaporates. The higher the vapor pressure, the more quickly the material tends to evaporate in the air. As it evaporates, these vapors become a health hazard that you can breathe in. If levels are high enough, you must wear respiratory protection to prevent breathing in the vapors. The fourth section of many MSDSs is the Fire and Explosion Hazard Data Information. It also contains useful information for laborers. For example, if a fire occurs on the job site, this section will tell what type of extinguishing materials you can use to put out the fire. Water cannot be used with many hazardous materials, especially fuels like gasoline. Consult the MSDS before using a hazardous substance to find the right extinguishing material. Other important information in the Fire and Explosion Hazard Data section include the flash point, flammable and explosive limits of the material. The flash point is the lowest temperature at which a flammable liquid gives off enough vapor to burn. The flammable limits and explosive limits are expressed by letters and numbers. They show the minimum and maximum concentrations of a material that can result in explosions or fires. The minimum or lower limits are expressed by the terms LEL, or lower explosive limit, and LFL, or lower flammable limit. The maximum or upper limits are expressed by the terms UEL for upper explosive limit and UFL for upper flammable limit. Concentrations above and below these limits will not burn or explode. Between the LEL and UEL limits, great hazard exists. The other information in the Fire and Explosion Hazard Data section is unusual fire or explosive hazards. These are often expressed as what might happen to a container under different circumstances. This information is useful for storing materials. For example, some containers might explode if they're exposed to too much heat or if the container is dropped. A fifth section of the MSDS is reactivity data. The reactivity data section tells you what conditions to avoid, such as heat, open flames, electrical equipment, or what other materials to keep away from the hazardous substances in the container. A very important word in this section is the word polymerization. Polymerization means whether a material can react with itself. If it does, it can cause a rapid buildup of heat and pressure and can lead to an explosion. When you see an X beside the polymerization hazard, it means be extra careful with the handling of the material. The sixth section is often entitled Health and Hazard Information and contains some of the most important information for laborers in the entire MSDS. Information in this section includes what will happen from overexposure, first aid directions, and routes of entry. Laborers must understand every term in this section. For example, there are 4 routes of entry through which hazardous materials can harm your body: inhalation or breathing in the materials, skin contact or absorbing the materials through your skin, ingestion or swallowing the materials, and puncture or having the chemical enter your body through a wound. On a typical MSDS, the routes of entry through which a chemical can attack your body will be checked or X'd. Health hazards are usually expressed as acute and chronic hazards. Acute means effects that occur in a relatively short period of time, such as minutes, hours, or perhaps even a day following exposure. Examples of hazardous materials with acute effects include many cleaners and solvents, such as acetone, that might irritate your eyes and your skin or can cause nausea. With higher exposures, it can cause vomiting or dizziness. Chronic effects take place in your body over a long period of time, usually months or years, and often occur with repeated exposure to the contaminant. Lung cancer is a possible chronic effect of exposure to asbestos over a long period of time. Target organs is the term that refers to the parts of the body that the hazardous material affects. For example, lime or concrete affects your skin on contact, whereas most solvents attack your liver after ingestion, inhalation, or skin contact. Signs and symptoms of exposure are early warning signs of whether the chemical is affecting you. Among the more common symptoms of exposure are dizziness, rash, headache, and nose and lung irritation. Another subheading in the Health and Hazard Information section is entitled Medical Conditions Aggravated by Exposure. It alerts laborers who have medical conditions to pay close attention to whether or not they can use a particular material on the job. For example, asthma can be made worse by working with many solvents if you do not have adequate respiratory protection. Another term found in the Health and Hazard section is carcinogenicity. It refers to whether or not the hazardous material has been proven to cause cancer in laboratory animals or people. If this box is checked, it means that in some type of study, a material caused cancer. The heading, Emergency and First Aid Procedures, provides you with the information you need to help a fellow laborer who has been overexposed to hazardous materials. Sometimes the Health and Hazard Information section also contains information about permissible exposure limits, PELs, for a material. Permissible exposure limits can be stated several ways. One way is parts per million, ppm, which tells us the allowable concentration in the air. The second way is time-weighted averages, TWAs, which is the amount of permissible exposure allowed to a worker over an 8-hour shift. Pay attention to these totals and match them to the monitoring information your employer posts at the job site. The seventh section of many MSDSs is called by a number of titles including Spill, Leak, and Disposal Procedures, or perhaps Precautions for Safe Handling. In either case, this section contains information about how to deal with a spill, as well as what to do with materials that you have already used and must dispose of. Hazardous materials remain hazardous even after their use. Typically, the material must be handled like all other hazardous waste removal. Information about cleaning up spills often will include a number of steps that you should follow as a standard operating procedure for removing the contamination and hazards. For example, you may find an MSDS that says you should first ventilate the area and eliminate all sources that could cause a fire. Then, once you are wearing the correct protective equipment, you should absorb the spill with some inert material that allows you to sweep the hazard into a container. Finally, you must seal the container with a lid and dispose of as hazardous materials. Sometimes the seventh section also includes information on how to safely store materials that have not yet been used. The eighth section of many MSDSs covers control measures to protect laborers from overexposure to the materials. These measures include the correct personal protective equipment that you should wear when working with and around hazardous materials. It also will show engineering controls, such as required ventilation. Always match your personal protective equipment to the specifications in the Control Measures section of the MSDS. Use a respirator with at least as much protection as is indicated. Wear the right protective gloves because some hazardous materials will dissolve and pass through the wrong gloves, and pay attention to eye protection and body coverings. Remember, airborne concentrations of a hazardous material may be different in different parts of a room. Often, concentrations will be higher around open containers of the material or in corners where the air doesn't move, even if a fan is being used for ventilation. Some labels and MSDSs are even beginning to use visual codes for the specific type of protective equipment that you should use. For example, the following code indicates some types of protective equipment. Look at the different types of respirators and the different kinds of eye protection and match the prescribed equipment with what you actually wear on the job. Many MSDSs contain a 9th section entitled Special Precautions and Comments. Oftentimes, this section includes reminders from other sections of the MSDS, reminders about how to handle the material and particular hazards to avoid. In this section, you might find things like avoid contact with eyes, and avoid breathing the vapor or dust, and wash thoroughly after handling the material, as ways to make sure that you protect yourself. Sometimes this last section also will include new information about how to mix or apply the material. You have now seen the parts of a typical MSDS. Sometimes the order may be different, but the information will still be there. It's important information that can save your life. Together with your supervisor, the MSDS provides knowledge about hazardous materials. Remember, your employer must have MSDSs available at the job site in order to determine exactly how you should handle the material. Now, let's review what you have learned for a moment. Every section of an MSDS is important. However, several sections are especially important to you as a laborer. Find these sections and read them. The most important single section is the Health and Hazard Information section. It is usually one of the last sections. It tells you things you need to know in order to protect yourself. Things such as routes of entry or how the hazardous material affects your body. This section also tells you about what parts of your body the chemical affects, symptoms of exposure, and whether the chemical causes acute or chronic health effects, first aid procedures, and exposure unit information. Another important section is called Control Measures. It usually is very close to the end of the MSDS. It tells you about the personal protective equipment you should wear when working with a hazardous substance. Always use the suggested respirator, eye protection, gloves, and body coverings. Remember that hazardous materials can only hurt you if they can get into or onto your body. The Physical and Chemical Information section is usually the second or third section and also is very important. It helps you know how the hazardous material acts. For example, if the material is heavier than air, it will collect in low spots like trenches and basements. This section will also tell you about whether the hazardous material floats, its color and odor, and how quickly the material evaporates into the surrounding air. A last critical section is called by several names, but most often spill and disposal will be used. It usually is one of the last two sections. It tells you how to handle, mix, and use the hazardous materials. It also says how to dispose of the material after you have used it on the job site. Remember, read labels and the MSDS. Talk with your supervisor about hazardous materials. Use the correct personal protective equipment and always work safely.